The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 9 of Death Comes for the Archbishop. I'm Matthew Handley. Today in our reading, Father Vaillant travels to Arizona to preach, and Bishop Latour aids a poor old servant woman in Santa Fe. In the second half of the program, Dr. Marcus Peter joins me again to discuss how he got into preaching and what he sees as challenges to evangelism. But first, Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Book 7, The Great Diocese. Chapter 1, The Month of Mary.
The bishop's work was sometimes assisted, often impeded, by external events. By the Gadsden Purchase, executed 3 years after Father Latour came to Santa Fe, the United States took over from Mexico a great territory which now forms southern New Mexico and Arizona. The authorities at Rome notified Father Latour that this new territory was to be annexed to his diocese, but that as the national boundary line often cuts parishes in two, the boundaries of church jurisdiction must be settled by a conference with the Mexican bishops of Chihuahua and Sonora. Such conferences would necessitate a journey of nearly 4,000 miles. As Father Vaillant remarked, at Rome they did not seem to realize that it was no easy matter for two missionaries on horseback to keep up with the march of history. The question hung fire for some years, the subject of voluminous correspondence. At last, in 1858, Father Vaillant was sent to arrange the debated boundaries with the Mexican bishops. He started in the autumn and spent the whole winter on the road, going from El Paso del Norte west to Tucson, on to Santa Magdalena and Guaymas, a seaport town on the Gulf of California, and did some seafaring on the Pacific before he turned homeward. On his return trip, he was stricken with malarial fever, resulting from exposure in bad water, and lay seriously ill in a cactus desert in Arizona. Word of his illness came to Santa Fe by an Indian runner, and Father Latour and Jacinto rode across New Mexico and half of Arizona, found Father Vaillant, and brought him back by easy stages. He was ill in the bishop's house for 2 months. This was the first spring that he and Father Latour had both been there at the same time, to enjoy the garden they had laid out soon after they first came to Santa Fe. It was the month of Mary and the month of May. Father Vaillant was lying on an army cot, covered with blankets, under the grape arbor of the garden, watching the bishop and his gardener work in the vegetable plots. The apple trees were in blossom, the cherry blooms had gone by. The air in the earth was interpenetrated in the warm gusts of spring, the soil was full of sunlight, and the sunlight full of red dust. The air one breathed was saturated with earthy smells, and the grass underfoot had a reflection of blue sky in it. This garden had been laid out 6 years ago, when the bishop brought his fruit trees, then dry switches, up from St. Louis in wagons, along with the Blessed Sisters of Loretto, who came to found the Academy of Our Lady of Light. The school was now well established, reckoned a benefit to the community by the Protestants as well as Catholics, and the trees were bearing. Cutting from them was already yielding fruit in many Mexican gardens. While the bishop was away on that first trip to Baltimore, Father Joseph had, in addition to his many official duties, found time to instruct their Mexican housekeeper, Fructosa, in cookery. Later, Bishop Latour took in hand Fructosa's husband, Tranquilino, and trained him as a gardener. They had boldly planned for the future. The ground behind the church, between the bishop's house and the academy, they laid out as a spacious orchard and a kitchen garden. Ever since then, the bishop had worked on it, planting and pruning. It was his only recreation. A line of young poplars linked the episcopal courtyard with the school. On the south, against the earth wall, was one row of trees they had found growing there when they first came. Old tamarisks with twisted trunks. They'd been so neglected, left to fight for life in such hard, sun-baked, burrow-trodden ground, that their trunks had the hardness of cypress. They looked, indeed, like very old posts, well seasoned and polished by time, miraculously endowed with the power to burst into delicate foliage and flowers, to cover themselves with long brooms of lavender-pink blossom. Father Joseph had come to love the tamarisk above all trees. It had been the companion of his wanderings. All along the way through the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, whenever he had come upon a Mexican homestead out of the sun-baked earth against the sun-baked adobe walls, the tamarisk waved its feathery plumes in bluish green. The family burro was tied to its trunk. The chickens scratched under it. The dogs slept in its shade. The washing was hung on its branches. Father Latour often remarked that this tree seemed especially designed in shape and color for the adobe village. The sprays of bloom which adorn it are merely another shade of red earth walls, and its fibrous trunk is full of gold and lavender tints. Father Joseph respected the bishop's eye for such things, but himself he loved it merely because it was the tree of the people, and was like one of the family in every Mexican household. This was a very happy season for Father Vaillant. For years he had not been able to properly observe this month, which in his boyhood he had selected to be the holy month of the year for him, dedicated to the contemplation of his gracious patroness. In his former missionary life on the Great Lakes, he used always to go into retreat at this season. But here there was no time for such things. Last year, in May, he had been on his way to help the Hopi Indians, riding 30 miles a day, marrying, baptizing, confessing as he went, making camp in the sandhills at night. His devotions had been constantly interrupted by practical considerations. But this year, because of his illness, the month of Mary he had been able to give to Mary. To her he had consecrated his waking hours. At night he sank to sleep with the sense of her protection. In the morning when he awoke, before he had opened his eyes, he was conscious of a special sweetness in the air, Mary and the month of May. Alma Mater Redemptoris. Once more he had been able to worship with the ardor of a young religious, for whom religion is pure personal devotion, unalloyed by expediency and the benumbering cases of a missionary's work. Once again, this had been his month. His patroness had given it to him, the season that had always meant so much in his religious life. He smiled to remember a time long ago when he was a young curate at Sondre in the Puy-de-Dôme, how he had planned a special season of devotion to the Blessed Virgin for May, and how the old priest to whom he was assistant had blasted his hopes by cold disapproval. The old man had come up through the Terror, and had been trained in the austerity of those days by the persecution of the clergy, and he was not untouched by Jansenism. Young Father Joseph bore his rebuke with meekness, and went sadly to his own chamber. There he took his rosary and spent the entire day in prayer. Not according to my desires, but if it is for thy glory, grant me this boon, O Mary, my hope. In the evening of that same day, the old pastor sent for him, and unsolicited granted him the request he had so sternly denied in the morning. How joyfully Father Joseph had written all this to his sister Philomene, then a pupil with the nuns of the Visitation in their native Riom, begging her to make him a quantity of artificial flowers for his May altar. How richly she had responded! And she rejoiced no less than he that his May devotions were so largely attended, especially by the young people of the parish, in whom a notable increase of piety was manifest. Father Vaillant's had been a close-knit family. Losing their mother while they were yet children had brought the brothers and sisters the closer together, and with this sister, Philomene, he had shared all of his hopes and desires in his deepest religious life. Ever since then, all the important events in his own history had occurred in the blessed month when this sinful and sullied world puts on white as if to commemorate the Annunciation, and becomes, for a little, lovely enough to be in truth the bride of Christ. It was in May that he had been given grace to perform the hardest act of his life, to leave his country, to part from his dear sister and his father, under what sad circumstances, and to start for the New World to take up a missionary's labors. That parting was not a parting, but an escape, a running away, a betrayal of family trust for the sake of a higher trust. How he could smile now, but at that time it had been terrible enough. The bishop, thinning cares yonder, would remember. It was because of what Father Latour had been to him in that hour indeed that Father Joseph was here in a garden in Santa Fe. He would never have left his dear Sandusky when the newly appointed bishop had asked him to share his hardships, had he not said to himself, "Ah, now it is he who is torn by perplexity. I will be to him now what he was to me that day when we stood by the roadside waiting for the diligence to Paris, and my purpose broke, and he saved me. That time came back upon Father Vaillant so keenly that he wiped a little moisture from his eyes. He was quickly moved, after the way of sick people, and he cleared his glasses and called, "Father Latour, it is time for you to rest your back. You've been stooping over a great while." The bishop came and sat down in a wheelbarrow that stood next to the edge of the arbor. "I am thinking that I shall no longer pray for your speedy recovery, Joseph. The only way I can keep my vicar within call is to have him sick." Father Joseph smiled. "You're not in Santa Fe a great deal yourself, my bishop." "Well, I shall be here this summer, and I hope to keep you with me. This year I want you to see my lotus flowers. Tranquillino will let the water into my lake this afternoon." The lake was a little pond in the middle of the garden into which Tranquillino, clever with water like all Mexicans, had piped a stream from the Santa Fe Creek flowing near at hand. "Last summer, while you were away," the bishop continued, "we had more than 100 lotus blossoms floating on that little lake, and all 5 from bulbs that I put in my valise in Rome." "When do they blossom?" "They begin in June, but they're best in July." "Then you must hurry them up a little, for with my bishop's permission I shall be gone in July." "So soon? And why?" Father Vaillant moved uneasily under his blankets. "To hunt for lost Catholics, John. Utterly lost Catholics down in your new territory near Tucson. There are hundreds of poor families down there who have never seen a priest. I want to go from house to house this time, to every little settlement. They are full of devotion and faith, and it has nothing to feed upon but the most mistaken superstitions. They remember all their prayers wrong. They cannot read, and since no one is there to instruct them, how can they get it right? They are like seeds, full of germination, but with no moisture. A mere contact is enough to make them a living part of the church. The more I work with the Mexicans, the more I believe it was people like them that our Savior bore in mind when he said, 'Unless ye become as little children.' He was thinking of people who are not clever in the things of the world, whose minds are not upon gain and worldly advancement. These poor Christians are not thrifty like our country people at home. They have no veneration for property, no sense of material values. I stop a few hours in a village, I administer the sacraments and hear confessions. I leave in every little house some token, a rosary or a religious picture, and I go away feeling that I have conferred immeasurable happiness and have released faithful souls that were shut away from God by neglect. Down near Tucson, a Pima Indian convert once asked me to go off into the desert with him as he had something to show me. He took me into a place so wild that a man less accustomed to these things might have mistrusted and feared for his life. We were descending into a terrifying canyon of black rock, and there in the depths of the cave he showed me a golden chalice, vestments and cruets, all the paraphernalia for celebrating Mass. His ancestors had hidden these sacred objects there when the mission was sacked by the Apaches, and he did not know how many generations ago. The secret had been handed down in his family, and I was the first priest who had ever come to restore to God his own. To me, that is the situation in a parable. The faith in that wild frontier is like a buried treasure. They guard it, but they do not know how to use it to their soul's salvation. A word, a prayer, a service is all that is needed to set free those souls in bondage. I confess that I'm covetous of that mission. I desire to be the man who restores these lost children to God. It will be the greatest happiness of my life." The bishop did not reply at once to this appeal. At last he said gravely, "You must realize that I have need of you here, Father Joseph. My duties are too many for one man." "But you do not need me so much as they do." Father Joseph threw off his coverings and sat up in his cassock, putting his feet to the ground. "Any one of our good French priests from Montferrand can serve you here. It is work that can be done by intelligence, but down there it is work for the heart, for a peculiar sympathy, and none of our new priests understand those poor natures as I do. I've almost become a Mexican. I've learned to like chili colorado and mutton fat. Their foolish ways no longer offend me. Their faults are very dear to me. I am their man." No doubt, but I must insist upon your lying down for the present." Father Vaillant, flushed and excited, dropped back upon his pillows, and the bishop took a short turn through the garden. to the row of tamarisk trees and back. He walked slowly, with even, unhesitating pace, with that slender, unrigid erectness and fine carriage of head which always made him seem master of the situation. No one would have guessed that a sharp struggle was going on within him. Father Joseph's impassioned request had spoiled a cherished plan and brought Father Latour a bit of personal disappointment. There was but one thing to do. Before he had reached the tamarisks, he had done it. He broke off a spray of the dry lilac-colored flowers to punctuate and seal, as it were, his renunciation. He returned with the same easy, deliberate tread and stood smiling by the army cot. Your feeling must be your guide in this matter, Joseph. I shall not put any obstacle in your way. A certain care for your health I must insist upon, but when you are quite well, you must follow the duty that calls loudest. They were both silent for a few moments. Father Joseph closed his eyes against the sunlight, and Father Latour stood lost in thought, drawing the plume of tamarisk blossoms absently through his delicate, rather nervous fingers. His hands had a curious authority, but not the calmness so often seen in the hands of priests. They seemed always to be investigating and making firm decisions. The two friends were roused from their reflections by a frantic beating of wings. A bright flock of pigeons swept over their heads to the far end of the garden, where a woman was just emerging from the gate that led into the school grounds, Magdalena, who came over every day to feed the doves and to gather flowers. The sisters had given her charge of the altar decoration of the school chapel for this month, and she came for the bishop's apple blossoms and daffodils. She advanced in a whirlwind of gleaming wings, and Tranquillino dropped his spade and stood watching her. At one moment, the whole flock of doves caught around the light in such a way that they all became invisible at once, dissolved in light, and disappeared as salt dissolves in water. The next moment they flashed around, black and silver against the sun. They settled upon Magdalena's arms and shoulders, ate from her hand. When she put a crust of bread between her lips, two doves hung in the air before her face, stirring their wings and pecking at the morsel. A handsome woman she had grown to be, with her comely figure and deep claret color under the golden brown of her cheeks. Who would think to look at her now that we took her from a place where every vileness of cruelty and lust was practiced, murmured Father Vaillant. Not since the days of early Christianity has the Church been able to do what it can here. She is but 27 or 8 years old. I wonder whether she ought not to marry again, the bishop said thoughtfully. Though she seems contented, I have sometimes surprised a tragic shadow in her eyes. Do you remember the terrible look in her when we first saw her? Can I ever forget it? But her body has changed. She was then a shapeless, cringing creature. I thought her half-witted. No, she has had enough of the storms of this world. Here she is safe and happy. Father Vaillant sat up and called to her. Magdalena, Magdalena, my child, come here and talk to us for a little. Two men grow lonely when they see nobody but each other.
Chapter 2, December Night.
Father Vaillant had been absent in Arizona since midsummer, and it was now December. Bishop Latour had been going through one of those periods of coldness and doubt which from his boyhood had occasionally settled down upon his spirit and made him feel an alien wherever he was. He attended to his correspondence, went on his rounds among the parish priests, held services at missions that were without pastors, superintended the building of the addition to the sister school, but his heart was not in these things. One night, about 3 weeks before Christmas, he was lying in bed, unable to sleep, with the sense of failure clutching at his heart. His prayers were empty words and had brought him no refreshment. His soul had become a barren field. He had nothing within himself to give his priests or his people. His work seemed superficial, a house built upon the sands. His great diocese was still a heathen country. The Indians traveled their old road of fear and darkness, battling with evil omens and ancient shadows. The Mexicans were children who played with their religion. As night wore on, the bed on which the bishop lay became a bed of thorns. He could bear it no longer. Getting up in the dark, he looked out the window and was surprised to find that it was snowing. that the ground was already lightly covered. The full moon, hidden by veils of cloud, threw a pale phosphorescent luminescence over the heavens, and the towers of the church stood up black against this silvery fleece. Father Latour felt a longing to go into the church to pray, but instead he lay down again under his blankets. Then, realizing that it was the cold of the church he shrank from, and despising himself, he rose again, dressed quickly, and went out into the court, throwing on over his cassock that faithful old cloak that was the twin of Father Vaillant's. They had bought the cloth for these coats in Paris long ago, when they were young men staying at the seminary for foreign missions in the Rue de Bac, preparing for their first voyage to the New World. The cloth had been made up into caped riding cloaks by a German tailor in Ohio and lined with fox fur. Years afterward, when Father Latour was about to start on his long journey in search of his bishopric, that same tailor made the cloaks over and relined them with squirrel skins, as more appropriate for a mild climate. These memories and many others went through the bishop's mind as he wrapped the trusty garment about him and crossed the court to the sacristy with the big iron key in his hand. The court was white with snow, and the shadows of wall and buildings stood out sharply in the faint light from the moon muffled in vapor. In the deep doorway of the sacristy he saw a crouching figure. A woman, he made out, and she was weeping bitterly. He raised her up and took her inside. As soon as he had lit a candle, he recognized her, and could have guessed her errand. It was an old Mexican woman called Sada, who was a slave in an American family. They were Protestants, very hostile to the Roman Church, and they did not allow her to go to Mass or to receive the visit of a priest. She was carefully watched at home, but in winter, when the heated rooms of the house were desirable to the family, she was put to sleep in a woodshed. Tonight, unable to sleep for the cold, she gathered the courage for this heroic action, had slipped out through the stable door, and come running up an alleyway to the house of God to pray. Finding the front doors of the church fastened, she made her way into the bishop's garden and come round to the sacristy, only to find that, too, shut against her. The bishop stood holding the candle and watching her face, while she spoke her few words. A dark brown peon face, worn thin and sharp by life and sorrow. It seemed to him that he had never seen pure goodness shine out of a human countenance as it did from hers. He saw that she had no stockings under her shoes, the cast-off rawhides of her master, and beneath her frayed black shawl was only a thin calico dress, covered with patches. Her teeth stuck together as she stood, trying to control her shivering. With one movement of his free hand, the bishop took the furred coat from his shoulders and put it about her. This frightened her. She cowered under it, murmuring, "Ah, no, no, Padre. You must obey your Padre, my daughter. Draw that cloak about you, and we will go into the church to pray." The church was utterly black except for the red spark of the sanctuary lamp by the high altar. Taking her hand and holding the candle before him, he led her across the choir to the Lady Chapel. There he began to light the tapers before the Virgin. Old Sada fell to her knees and kissed the floor. She kissed the feet of the Holy Mother, the pedestal on which they stood, crying all the while. But from the working of her face, from the beautiful tremors which passed over it, he knew they were tears of ecstasy. 19 years, Father, 19 years since I have seen the holy things of the altar. All that is past, Sada. You have remembered the holy things in your heart. We will pray together. The bishop knelt beside her, and they began, O Holy Mary, Queen of Virgins. More than once, Father Vaillant had spoken to the bishop of this aged captive. There had been much whispering among the devout women of the parish about her pitiful case. The Smiths, with whom she lived, were Georgia people, who had at one time lived in El Paso del Norte, and they had taken her back to their native state with them. Not long ago, some disgrace had come upon this family in Georgia. They had been forced to sell all their Negro slaves and flee the state. The Mexican woman they could not sell because they had no legal title to her. Her position was irregular. Now that they were back in a Mexican country, the Smiths were afraid their charwoman might escape from them and find asylum among her own people, so they kept strict watch upon her. They did not allow her to go outside her own patio, not even to accompany her mistresses to the market. 2 women of the altar guild had been so bold as to go to the patio to talk with Sada while she was washing clothes, but they had been rudely driven away by the mistress of the house. Mrs. Smith had come running out into the court, half-dressed, and told them that if they had business at her casa, they were to come in by the front door, and not sneak in through the stable to frighten a poor silly creature. When they said they had come to ask Sada to go to Mass with them, she told them she had got the poor creature out of her clutches of the priest once, and would see to it that she did not fall into them again. Even after that rebuff, a very pious neighbor woman had tried to say a word to Sada through the alley door of the stable, where she was unloading wood off the burro. But the old servant had put her finger to her lips and motioned the visitor away, glancing back over her shoulder all the while with such an expression of terror that the intruder hastened off, surmising that Sada would be harshly used if she were caught speaking to anyone. The good woman went immediately to Father Vaillant with his story, and he had consulted the bishop, declaring that something ought to be done to secure the consolations of religion for the bondwoman. But the bishop replied that the time was not yet, for at the present it was inexpedient to antagonize these people. The Smiths were leaders of a small group of low-caste Protestants who took every occasion to make trouble for the Catholics. They hung about the door of the church on festival days with mockery and loud laughter, spoke insolently to the nuns in the street, stood jeering and blaspheming when the procession went by on Corpus Christi Sunday. There were 5 sons in the Smith family, fellows of low habits and evil tongues. Even the 2 younger boys, still children, showed a vicious disposition. Tranquillino had repeatedly driven these 2 boys out of the bishop's garden, where they had come with their lewd companions to rob the young pear trees or to speak filth against the priests. When they rose from their knees, Father Latour told Sada he was glad to know that she remembered her prayers so well. "Ah, Padre, every night I say my rosary to my Holy Mother, no matter where I sleep," declared the old creature passionately, looking up into his face and pressing her knotted hands against her breast. When he asked if she had her beads with her, she was confused. She kept them tied with a cord around her waist under her clothes, as the only place she could hide them safely. He spoke soothingly to her. "Remember this, Sada, in the year to come, during the novena before Christmas, I will not forget to pray for you whenever I offer the blessed sacrament of the Mass. Be at rest in your heart, for I will remember you in my silent supplications before the altar, as I do my own sisters and my nieces." Never, as he afterward told Father Vaillant, had it been permitted him to behold such deep experience of the holy joy of religion as on that pale December night. He was able to feel, kneeling beside her, the preciousness of the things of the altar to her who was without possessions, the tapers, the image of the Virgin, the figures of the saints, the cross that took away indignity from suffering and made pain and poverty a means of fellowship with Christ. Kneeling beside the much-enduring bondwoman, he experienced these holy mysteries, as he had done in his young manhood. He seemed able to feel it all meant to her, to know that there was a kind woman in heaven, though there were such cruel ones on earth. Old people, who have felt blows and toil and known the world's hard hand, need, even more than children do, a woman's tenderness. Only a woman divine could know all that a woman can suffer. Not often, indeed, had Jean-Marie Latour come so near to the fountain of all pity as in the Lady Chapel that night. The pity that no man born of woman could ever utterly cut himself off from, that there was for the murderer on the scaffold as it was for the dying soldier or the martyr on the rack. The beautiful concept of Mary pierced the priest's heart like a sword. "O Sacred Heart of Mary," she murmured by his side, and how he felt that name was food and raiment, friend and mother to her. He received the miracle in her heart into his own, saw through her eyes, knew that his poverty was as bleak as hers. When the kingdom of heaven had first come into the world, into a cruel world of torture and slaves and masters, he who brought it had said, "And whosoever is least among you, the same shall be first in the kingdom of heaven." This church was Sada's house, and he was a servant in it. The bishop heard the old woman's confession. He blessed her and put both hands upon her head. When he took her down to the nave to let her out of the church, sought a maid to lift his cloak from her shoulders. He restrained her, telling her she must keep it for her own and sleep in it that night. But she slipped out of it hurriedly. Such a thought seemed to terrify her. "No, no, father, if they were to find it on me." More than that, she did not accuse her oppressors, but as she put it off, she stroked the old garment and patted it as if it were a living thing that had been kind to her. Happily, Father Latour bethought himself of a little silver medal, with a figure of the Virgin he had in his pocket. He gave it to her, telling her that it had been blessed by the Holy Father himself. Now she would have a treasure to hide and guard, to adore while her watchers slept. Ah, he thought, for one who cannot read or think, the image, the physical form of love. He fitted the great key into its lock. The door swung slowly back on its wooden hinges. The peace without seemed all one with the peace in his own soul. The snow had stopped. The gauzy clouds had ribbed the arch of heaven and were now all sunk into one soft white fog bank over the Sangre de Cristo mountains. The full moon shone high in the blue vault, majestic, lonely, benign. The bishop stood in the doorway of his church, lost in thought, looking at the line of black footprints his departing visitor had left in the wet scurf of snow. Coming up,
the problem we face here in the United States is really the decline of that third pillar. We are perishing for lack of knowledge.
Now this.
Support for this program comes from NordVPN, a provider of virtual private network services. NordVPN offers tools designed to encrypt internet traffic and route connections through remote servers, helping to enhance online privacy and reduce digital tracking. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/NordVPN and by Expedia, an online travel service offering booking options for flights, hotels, rental cars, and vacation packages. Expedia provides tools to compare and book accommodations, transportation, and activities with a wide selection of options available. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/Expedia.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Matthew Handley. Modern-day preachers face many challenges, and in no small part, this is due to the post-Christian world that we live in. Dr. Marcus Peter is joining me again to discuss his conversion to Catholicism and some of the challenges he sees in evangelism. Dr. Marcus Peter is the Director of Theology for Ave Maria Radio and the Cresta Institute. He's the radio host of the daily EWTN drive time program, Ave Maria in the Afternoon. He's also the TV host of Unveiling the Covenants. He's a prolific author, biblical theologian, cultural commentator, and international speaker. You can follow his work at marcusbpeter.com. Marcus, welcome back to the program.
Always a joy, my friend. Thank you for having me on.
Tell me about your personal calling to evangelize and to preach.
Wow. So the calling came as a bit of a surprise, if I'm being honest. I've been doing public speaking since I was 9 years old. It was just one of those things I was pushed into, kind of giving talks on various topics at the school level. And I had teachers who encouraged me to do that. And as I was really young and starting to play with the notion of atheism, I was getting more and more angry with organized religion. And as I studied more, especially the thought of people like Nietzsche and some dabbling in Feuerbach and Hume and Kant, you develop a very fragmented view of the world, but you think you have all the answers. Mm-hmm. And I just got really angry at everything. I also just very humbly put this out there. I didn't have the best experience growing up. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And so all of that anger needed to be channeled somewhere, and it just made sense to channel it towards this notion of an organized religion, especially the Christian faith, because you've got this concept of a gospel that talks about God being love, and the life that I knew, both intellectually as well as in terms of reality, were not reflective of any kind of love. And so that public speaking that I was doing as a young student overflowed into the work of being an atheist speaker. And the weird thing was I did this in a misplaced sense of what I thought was goodness. If God wasn't real, I thought it was my obligation to convince people that their time in organized religion was a waste. And so that's what I did, systematically debunking the notion of a God, let alone the control, the opiate of the masses that was organized religion. And that's, if we want to say honestly, this work of de-evangelization was where I started. And then I had this overnight encounter with Christ, which is a bit of a story in and of itself. And I was so deeply ashamed of the life that I'd lived and what I'd done that I started studying the scriptures to learn more about this Jesus that I had been telling people not to believe in. But I never thought I would be a preacher. I just thought I had an obligation to study. I finally found truth, and I wanted to dive as deep as possible into it. And without exaggerating the story here, this is truly what happened. I was sitting down listening to a person give a talk once. He wasn't an ordained pastor or anything. He was a lay preacher. And I heard, without exaggeration, I heard the audible voice of whom I believe to be God tell me, I will use you to proclaim my gospel. And it came out of nowhere. I was just one person in the crowd. There was nothing special about me. And I nearly fell out of my chair because stuff like that didn't happen to me. You know, it's weird. And I kept it to myself because I didn't want people to think I was nuts. And true enough, about a week later, someone who knew my story from where I came, militant atheist, gangster rapper, to now giving up all of that and just being a student of the scriptures. And he said, I just want you to share what Jesus did in your life. And that began what has now become 17 years of an evangelistic ministry. But the call came accidentally. But it was also driven by an impetus when I realized that God was calling me to this, that what he had given me before in terms of a capacity to speak, to learn these things and to teach them, I realized what I didn't have. And so I realized what other people didn't have as well. And that's why I'm driven by this hunger, that I wake up every day and all I want to do is tell people about Jesus, because I remember 20 years living without this. And it pains me to know that there are other people out there like this. So, while the call itself came accidentally, in all honesty, I think God spent all my life preparing me to do this work. I just didn't see it. Really what happened was I was tricked into going to a charismatic prayer meeting, and being the hyper-rational intellectual that I tried to model myself, and you can think about the hubris I had, I'm going to mention these names, and you can already envision what young Marcus was like. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and the smug intellectualism with which they spoke. I mistook that for authority. I mistook that for men who had the answers. And so they weren't confused. They weren't duped by this horrendous mythology that is organized religion. And I was approaching things from that perspective. And I was tricked into going to a charismatic prayer meeting. And they told me they needed a bass guitarist. I was a musician. I was a rapper. But I was also lead singer of a rock band. It was a cover band. And I was the bass guitarist, and the person who called me to this prayer meeting knew that I played the bass. They knew they needed a bass guitarist, and they also knew I didn't do much on Tuesday nights because most of my performances were from Wednesday night onwards. And so they said, look, we know you don't do things most Tuesday nights. Just come. We need a bass guitarist. You don't have to worship. You don't have to believe anything. We just need a bassist. And I said yes, but I told them my conditions are twofold. Number one, your God isn't real, and I'm coming there to prove this. And number two, I'm coming there to prove that I'm the best bassist you've ever seen. I was so full of myself, and that's exactly what I went there to do. And what hit me that night was super irrational. It was beyond the intellectual categories that I'd made for myself. I was hit with, for want of a better expression, an overwhelming sense of unconditional love that broke quite literally the barriers I had put up in my heart, and it shattered me to tears. It was a sudden realization that my life had meaning and purpose. I exist because the good God called me into being, and that I wasn't a mistake. And I just broke down into tears. And immediately my mind, having been shaped by all the study I did before, made certain corollaries. If God wasn't real, I thought that I had a moral obligation to pull people away from religion. But if God is real, then I'm in trouble because I've been lying to people. But secondly, I need to find out who this God is, and I'm encountering him now, and his name is Jesus Christ. So that began a tremendous amount of study. The event itself, I was hard-hearted, and I was hit hard by the grace of God from heaven. I didn't know what that would lead to, other than I now had an obligation to find out what happened to me, because my life changed overnight. That was the first night in my life that I went to sleep peacefully, and I've been sleeping peacefully ever since, 17 years. Just to kind of expand the narrative, up till age 20, whenever I went to bed, I felt darkness weighing down on me. And I don't want to hyper-spiritualize things, but this was really the experience. And so I'd go to bed wishing I wouldn't wake up. I'd wake up wondering why I'd woken up. And that night, May the 20th, 2008, when I went to bed, I no longer had that. There was a kind of liberation that had taken place. And so I just committed myself to study. So I want to say it was arguments that broke me through first, but really it was an encounter with the love of God that compelled me to seek out arguments and answers.
Well, I will say, at least for me too, God has smacked me upside the head several times, but never while I'm playing bass at a concert. So that's a really good testimony, and I appreciate you sharing that. So as you work to kind of move on from that, and you're beginning to preach the gospel, what were some of those initial challenges that you saw, and how did you overcome some of those challenges of preaching?
They were multifold. The first was personal reputation. People knew who I was. They knew what I did. They knew what I believed. They knew how I conducted myself. And there was a real arduous work of needing to undo the reputation, the paradigm people had of me. My own parents, my father, when he found out that I'd given my life to Christ, he didn't believe it. He said he won't last a month. It's been 17 years, so I praise the Lord for that. But so that was the first hurdle. And because of that hurdle, I remember going to... So my parents are nominal Catholic, and they've come around since. They're a lot more devoted. But I went to their pastor, I went to their parish priest, and I told him, hey, I had this encounter with Jesus. I don't know what's going on with me other than I've left my music career. I've left the life that I once lived. I'm no longer traveling and giving talks about atheism. I believe in God. I'm studying the scriptures. I need someone to guide me. And this guy said, he was a priest, Catholic priest. He said, nope, I'm not going to do anything for you. Go home and be a good son to your parents. And so that was the second hurdle, which is syncretistic religion. Catholicism in most of Asia, especially in Malaysia, is syncretistic. All religions are one. You're all climbing the same mountain from different areas, and you'll all reach the top at the same time. And so, no, why bother be Catholic? Just be whatever you are. You're going to go to heaven anyways. And so this guy, this priest, Catholic priest, was also going to Hindu temples and Buddhist temples and offering sacrifices to idols. And so he just didn't want to help evangelize me. He didn't want to guide me because he didn't see the merit of it. And in some sense, God saved me because I don't know what would have happened to me if I journeyed with him. But the Pentecostals, the Assemblies of God, they took me under their wing and they taught me. So that was the third hurdle, discovering for myself, by God's grace, people whom could guide me so that I wasn't running on my own. And so God led me to them. The fourth hurdle became, Malaysia is a Sunni Muslim nation. Mm-hmm. You don't have a lot of support for the work of evangelization.
Right.
And if you get influential, if you get to a point where you're converting people, you're actually effective in the proclamation of the faith, the Sharia government sees you as a threat. And so a lot of Pentecostal preachers have been kidnapped and killed by the Sharia government. And we know they're killed because they're kidnapped. We know they're kidnapped. It's an organized effort by a federal Sharia government, and they're never seen from or heard from again. So we just surmise it that way. And so when you're a Christian preacher in Malaysia, you know that you run that risk. You know that a target's put on your back. And this is not a cause for sympathy. I'm not calling for some kind of awe. This is just the reality of how things are outside of America. Mm-hmm. Religious freedom is not the same as it is here, and we take that for granted. So that was another hurdle, the reality that was what I had to face. But I was so driven by the gospel of Jesus Christ that the final hurdle would prove to be my insufficient study. The truth of the matter is I'd heard enough scripture and things about Jesus growing up that I was able to tell people I encountered him, but I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, Matthew, just to be very honest, I told people the Catechism of the Catholic Church was the work of the devil. I was so anti-Catholic, and I was attacking the Catholic Church. And I told people, don't believe in Mary, don't pray to Mary, and the final hurdle would prove to be my own ignorance. And it was 2 years of sleepless, assiduous study that eventually made me Catholic. I didn't want to be. I wanted to be a pastor, but studying the church's documents, the church's history, studying the history of Christianity made me realize that I had no business being in the Pentecostal sphere, and I had to become Catholic.
So you've made this jump. You've come into the Catholic Church, and I'm at some point, obviously, you moved to the United States. Mm-hmm. What was that like?
I mean, prior to coming to the United States, after I became Catholic, I entered a missionary order, a Catholic missionary order, and it was a seminary. I was discerning the priesthood because I wanted to be a pastor as a Pentecostal, and I gave that up, so I figured, I could be a priest. And they sent me to Singapore, the Philippines, sometime in India. Prior to that, I'd spent a little bit of time in Thailand and Mauritius. And I'd spent different amounts of time, varying amounts of time in these countries. And I realized the hunger for the faith. I did a lot of evangelization in a lot of these countries. And by the time I moved to the U.S., I couldn't call myself the citizen of any one nation. But the other thing I also learned is the notion of cultural immersion really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of the heritage of Western civilization. Every part of the world, including the entire Eastern Hemisphere, if there is anything by way of progress, anything by way of advancement, flourishing, and even systematic legal authority and government, all of this, I discovered, was owed to the heritage of Christendom and Western civilization. Mm. And of course, these countries would never admit it, but it's true. It's objectively true. And so the British Empire brought the heritage of Christendom to as far as they did. And so even countries that had never been touched by the British, like Thailand, for example, still has a system of government that appeals to a very Catholic understanding of the dignity of human person and rights in light of systematic law. So when I came to the U.S., I found freedom for the first time, not just in terms of religion, but also intellectual freedom. The heritage of Western civilization had found tremendous flourishing here in the U.S. And so in Malaysia, for example, I couldn't get good Catholic books. The Islamic government just simply wouldn't import them. Here, I go on Amazon, it's like $1, $2. Or on eBay, people are getting rid of them. I go to thrift stores, and people are getting rid of them by the horde. So the resources to deepen my study of the faith. The other thing I also learned is, because Malaysia is a British Commonwealth nation, it's so entrenched in notions of Western civilization, there wasn't much by way of a culture jump. It wasn't like, it wasn't, I don't know, but British English is my first language. And so there wasn't a language barrier. I think the biggest problem I faced, Matthew, was that Americans are ignorant about other countries outside of America.
Yes.
And so people didn't know that Malaysia was British Commonwealth. They were kind of insulting about why I spoke English at all, let alone that I did as well as I did. And they also thought we lived on trees and swung from vine to vine and walked everywhere we went. And so it's really the biggest hurdle was explaining to people where I came from and why I am the way that I am.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because when I was younger, when I was 12, 13, 14, around then, we lived in Botswana in southern Africa, and I remember telling my friends at school before we moved, well, you're going to go without TV and you're going to live in a hut for 2 years? So, well, no, it's like Malaysia, certainly not as populated or as technologically advanced. It's a British Commonwealth. It's it's. They have cars. I went to school. They have shopping malls. It's not as vastly different as people think. Culturally, it's a little different, but that is one of my peeves as well. And especially when it comes to the church, in part because we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. It's amazing when we just had the election of Pope Leo XIV. where we have cardinals from all over the world come together, and it's one of those rare opportunities when people really get to see this really isn't just about what ex-bishop from Chicago or Atlanta or wherever says about anything. There's a whole lot more to it than what's outside of our borders here in the United States. And I'm glad to see that you see that too, as someone who has become an American by choice, and that's something that you have observed as well.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about this. I want to talk a little bit about your radio career, and your other methods of preaching, the things you've written, being on Unveiling the Covenants on television and radio. In the novel that we're working through here, Death Comes for the Archbishop, Bishop Latour is traveling around the American Southwest. He's meeting Mexicans. He's meeting different tribes of Native Americans. He's meeting white Protestants that have lived there. They work in the army or they're traders or whoever. He's observing that a lot of these people, and the Mexicans and the natives in particular, have been evangelized to several hundred years prior by the different religious that came through. But in many places, when the religious were recalled due to persecution or whatever the case may be, they weren't really evangelized to beyond a point. So that a lot of the people living there, they had a very basic understanding of their religion and nothing really beyond that. That's not too different from where I think we are today, in particular with young people, especially. But also, you think about the generation that was raised on what Bishop Barron would call the beige Catholicism of the 60s and 70s. And so I wonder, how do you make that approach to people in television, radio, writing, however, to people that have a very basic understanding of their Catholic faith or their Christian faith, if we're speaking more generally, and help bring out in them and preach to them that there's a whole lot more to it than the surface level understanding that they have?
The problem we face here in the United States is really the decline of that third pillar. And now I'll explain what this means. We're a tremendously unique nation, both in terms of our foundational heritage, but also in our contribution to global history and the way we flourished. We are seeing a kind of socio-political decline. I'm not saying, therefore, this is the end of the Republic. What I am saying is those things that made us as wondrous as we were throughout human history, we are now becoming the authors of our own denigration. And we are perishing for lack of knowledge.
Marcus, we are going to have to leave it there, but we'll pick this conversation up again next week. Thanks for being here. Next week on Death Comes for the Archbishop, Bishop Latour visits a Navajo friend of his and recalls his vicar from Arizona. I'm Matthew Handley. Lord willing, I will talk to you then.
Special thanks to our broadcast partners. The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley. Copyright 2025 M.H. Media Ventures, LLC. All rights reserved. For more, visit purplecatholic.com.